Well, yes, indeed. That music means that it's time for my Sunday sermon. And of course, this week I have to focus on the issue of the energy crisis, because on Thursday I gave a press conference with what I believe is the necessary solution, an uncomfortable solution to this huge crisis, because this is not just a crisis of price, which it is very much a crisis of price. It's also a crisis of supply. And the solutions from the Lib Dems and the Labour Party and from the odd Tory that seems to be awake and paying attention rather than being on holiday is all very short term. But this crisis could go on for years and years. And so I introduced an emergency energy plan that can resolve this crisis, that can literally stop people dying of cold and hunger this winter, that can protect consumers, that can protect businesses, protect jobs, and that can also reduce inflation significantly. And if you reduce inflation, that has the knock-on effect of reducing the pressure to raise interest rates. Because I have no doubt, folks, and I say this with deep trepidation, that this is the gravest energy crisis that we face since the Second World War. I think it's worse than in the 1970s. And this is as a result, yes, of course, the war in Ukraine and the actions of Putin has a role to play. But be under no illusions. This is the result of gross negligence by politicians and by civil servants over the last decade and more. Nothing less. They dramatically increased the dependency on others. Let me just give you a few examples. In the last decade, we've increased by 400% the amount of electricity that we import. That's all very well when the sun's shining and when those countries will send it to us. But what happens if they can't? We've allowed our domestic gas production in the last decade to drop by 43%, even though we're sitting on huge energy owned by us all. We decided, not very smart to use our own energy, let's send all our money overseas to buy someone else's energy. Brilliant. Thanks for that, you clueless civil servants, you useless politicians. Because between 1980 and 2005, we were completely self-reliant. We were exporting energy. Imagine that. This crisis wouldn't have hit us anything like as hard if we'd continued to use our vast energy treasure. In the last decade, we allowed our generating capacity of nuclear and of fossil fuels to decline by 30% and more. Now, you just think, why would you do that? When you shut an old, ageing power plant, power station, is it really smart not to replace it with something else? Do you not think that occasionally things might break? Because that's where we are. The risk of breakdowns has dramatically gone up. In France, for example, where about 70% of their energy comes from their nuclear power stations, guess what? They haven't been maintaining them properly, so they've got major maintenance problems in France, which means we can't rely on importing electricity from France, as we have done every year for the last few years from France every winter. We can't rely even on Norway. They've got their own shortages. In fact, so serious is this that France this winter wants actually to buy electricity from us. But we haven't got enough of our own. Thanks for that, civil servants and politicians. And all of that is ahead of what you sort of know just is coming down the pipe. Imagine if we have a severe, cold, windless winter. Yes, it's called Sods Law. And I'm afraid to say it, but that's how these things happen. We're literally having to pray for a mild but windy winter in order to keep the lights on and the gas flowing. I mean, unbelievable that a nation as developed, as technologically advanced as ours, is literally having to prey on the weather. And all of this is so totally unnecessary. I started talking about the energy crisis and the need to use shale gas last October. 10 months ago, I started on this. And I've been boring many of you ever since. But I think I've been proven right. The truth is the energy market has failed. It's no longer fit for purpose, and we have to declare what's called force majeure. It sounds a dramatic expression. It is. It basically means that the market has broken. The contract between the people and the energy producers has broken. It's failed. It's an extraordinary event, such as wartime. Well, there is a war in Central Europe, and we are in a global energy war. And what happened in the Second World War, for example, was the government had to take control of the pricing of production. And I'm saying, in this case, the government has to take control of the pricing of all of the UK energy production. Not the production itself, but the pricing of it. And that essentially it should revert to the average price that all the energy producers and generators that they received in 2021. When they were making profits, they weren't complaining back then, but that's what we've got to do. It's an extreme measure. As an entrepreneur, someone who believes in free markets, I feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable recommending this. But this, in my view, is the only solution that is durable and that solves the problems for so many people and so many businesses and so many jobs. And it can last as long as this global energy war lasts. And those energy producers in the UK that refuse, then I'm afraid they would have to face the nationalisation word, or if they reduce supply. I mean, this is difficult, uncomfortable stuff, but it has to be done. Because free markets work with smart regulation. And I'm afraid the politicians, the civil servants, the regulators, they have all failed. But what my solution would do is that it would immediately enable the domestic cap to come back down from over £3,500 a year, back down, I calculate, to about £1,750 a year. It would enable, for the first time, to be a cap on business. Some businesses are being quoted 80 to 90 pence per kilowatt hour. Totally unsustainable. Under my solution, the businesses could have a capped rate of about 35 pence per kilowatt hour. Not great compared to last year, but a lot better than the current alternative. And yes, there'd have to be some targeted help for the vulnerable, but it would be targeted. And this needs to remain, this uncomfortable, warlike response needs to remain until market conditions return. I don't know whether that's 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, but it only returns to normal when the supply and demand balance returns. And so we have to essentially look at the other side of this crisis. I've been talking about the price, but what about the supply crisis? People are assuming that if the Ukraine war ends, that Putin will turn his taps back on. Why would he do that? He's enjoying the economic pain and suffering that we in Western Europe are experiencing. He's not going to turn the taps back on. He'll constantly blather on about, oh, there's maintenance problems in Nord Stream 1 pipeline, etc., etc. We have a grave supply crisis, and we have to resolve that. And in my view, that requires a national planning regime with local compensation so that we can dramatically accelerate more investment and extraction of North Sea gas, of course, shale gas, of nuclear facilities. That's the way to deal with this crisis. We have to have a national planning regime with local compensation. I'll be talking later about the uselessness of the Labour and the Lib Dem solutions. People like Ed Davey, who tells me he's proud to have stopped, tells us all, he's proud to have stopped the fracking industry. That man is guilty of gross negligence. We should stop the renewable subsidies. We've got to get the supply side increased. This is what we've got to do. We've got to do it urgently, and folks, that requires leadership, it requires determination, and I hope Liz Truss will have that, but I'm not holding my breath. Here endeth my Sunday sermon.